In Acts 23, Paul is on trial, and I think what happens is that the Jews realise he's going to get off. So they mount a kind of there's a plan to assassinate him, and Paul finds out about it. And I've had two people want to kill me. One I didn't know about and one I did. And it was really interesting when you find out that someone wants to kill you. Well, Paul had that knowledge. We'll talk about that in a minute, but let's read. Paul, looking steadfastly at the council, said, "Brothers, I have lived before God in all good conscience until today." The high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to judge me according to the law, and you command me to be struck contrary to the law?" Those who stood by said, "Do you malign God's high priest?" Paul said, "I didn't know, brothers, that he was high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" When Paul perceived that one part was Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Men and brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." When he said this, an argument arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the crowd was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess all of these. A great clamour arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' part stood up and contended, saying, "We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or angel has spoken to him, let's not fight against God." When a great argument arose, the commanding officer, fearing that Paul would be torn in pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Cheer up, Paul. You have testified about me at Jerusalem, and so you must testify also at Rome." When it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 people who made that conspiracy. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a great curse to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now therefore, you with the council inform the commanding officer that he should bring him down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to judge his case more exactly. We are ready to kill him before he comes near." But Paul's sister's son heard that they were lying in wait, and he came and entered into the barracks and told Paul. Paul summoned one of the centurions and said, "Bring this young man to the commanding officer, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the commanding officer and said, "Paul the prisoner summoned me and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you." The commanding officer took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" He said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though intending to inquire somewhat more accurately concerning him. Therefore don't yield to them, for more than 40 men lie in wait, who have bound themselves under a curse to neither eat nor drink until they have killed him. Now they are ready, looking for the promise from you." So the commanding officer let the young man go, charging him, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." He called to himself 2 of the centurions and said, "Prepare 200 soldiers to go as far as Caesarea, with 70 horsemen, and 200 men armed with spears at the 3rd hour of the night." He asked them to provide animals, that they might set Paul on one and bring him safely to Felix the governor. He wrote a letter like this: "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them, when I came with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Desiring to know the cause why they accused him, I brought him down to their council. I found him to be accused about questions of their law, but not to be charged with anything worthy of death or imprisonment. When I was told that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him to you immediately, charging his accusers also to bring their accusations against him before you. Farewell." So the soldiers carrying out their orders took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But on the next day they left with horsemen to go with him and return to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. When he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear you fully when your accusers also arrive." He commanded that he be kept in Herod's palace. So these chapters at the end of the second, like to the end of Acts, they're very interesting. Like, they're so historical, and some people think that Luke, makes stuff up, but it's so fascinating that the precise language that Luke uses matches things that get discovered in archaeology. And so we've got, like, in all these chapters, we've got things like about who governors are and how trials take place and how Roman armies work, and all of this type of stuff is so precisely accurate to the time. And I just find it interesting. And historians find it interesting because there are very few, this is 2,000 years ago, there were not that many things written down that were written down by eyewitnesses like this. And so Paul is kind of been accused, like the Jews basically hate his guts. Paul's been brought forward to he's been accused, he's been brought forward to speak to the Sanhedrin, and he realizes that the Sanhedrin's got Pharisees and Sadducees in it. Now, he would have known that, but I guess he's more clearly thinking this. You might get the impression living today, in 2024, that the Sanhedrin's this group of unified people, but no. The Sanhedrin's like an elected body. I looked it up this week. It's from the Greek word Sanhedrion, which means sitting together. And it was basically some kind of administrative committee in the land of Judea, which people were elected to. So, like a local council, for example, you can have local councillors. In Rockhampton, we have 8 of them. They're all elected into their position. Some of them have the same perspective and some of them have different perspectives. So they have these discussions at the table about what to do, and sometimes they agree and sometimes they don't. And the Sanhedrin, this is like an elected body. It's got all sorts of people in it, but it's got this large group of Sadducees. The Sadducees are a majority in the Sanhedrin, but they're a minority out of the Sanhedrin, whereas the Pharisees are a minority representative in the Sanhedrin, but in normal life, there are a lot more Jews who are Pharisees. So there's fewer Pharisees representing a larger amount of people in this committee. But Paul himself is a Pharisee, and these 2 groups were Jewish, but they had very different kind of perspectives on, being Jewish. And so the Sadducees didn't believe there was kind of like heaven. They didn't believe there was like a eternity. Like, they believed this life was all there was. I find that so strange that, if there isn't an eternity and if there isn't a resurrection, it's like, it kind of seems like living a good life to please God seems a bit pointless. And that is what Paul says later when we get into his letters and he's talking about the resurrection. He says if the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen, everything is pointless. And but anyway, that's the Sadducees don't believe there's a resurrection, but the Pharisees did. Paul's being accused of creating a riot, and but the riot, a few chapters ago, the riot actually breaks out on the Temple Mount just because he's there. He doesn't say anything or do anything to make the riot start, but the ruckus starts because others notice him there and they don't like him, and so the chaos begins. And however, in this trial where he's before the Sanhedrin, he realizes, there's this difference of opinion here. And he says in what verse is it? There's a lot of interesting things in this chapter. He says in verse 6, he says, "I am being tried concerning my hope of the resurrection of the dead." So he realizes there's a group here that don't believe in resurrections, and there's a group that do. And he says, "I'm being tried because I believe in the resurrection." And immediately that causes this group of the Sanhedrin to start arguing amongst themselves. So I guess if if you're going to accuse Paul of causing a ruckus, well, he didn't in that initial instance, but he did this time. And later on, he admits it. He says, well, I kind of did do it in that moment. We'll get to that in chapters ahead. And but then there's this plot. They want to kill him. Now, I think they realise that the Sanhedrin realises they want Paul gone. They don't like him, but they realise that in Roman law, he's done nothing wrong. The Romans don't care what your interpretation is of the Old Testament, how you want to practice your Judaism. They really don't care about all of that. All they want is peace. So the accusations against Paul aren't meaningful to the Romans and certainly not enough to kill him, and he's a Roman citizen anyway. So they decide that they have this plot. 40 people take a vow. We're not going to eat. They put themselves under a curse. We're not going to eat until we kill him. I always wondered what happened to those 40 people because they didn't kill him. Did they just I'm guessing they broke their vow and put themselves under the curse. But Paul hears of it. Once the Roman, the captain of the guard in Jerusalem hears this is Lysias, he immediately puts Paul with a mounted guard, 200 soldiers, there was a total of 470 men. 70 of them were on horseback. He puts Paul with them and sends them to Caesarea. That's how seriously he took it. He's keeping Paul safe. There was an obligation to keep Romans safe. And so all the Roman Empire was really split into people who were citizens and people who weren't. But citizens had rights and everyone else didn't. We're used to the idea that everyone's got rights. And but in Roman times, only citizens had rights and they were a minority. Paul himself is a Roman citizen by birth. His father was a Roman citizen because his father worked with the Roman army making tents. And so after a certain period of time, like 20 years of service, they gave him Roman citizenship as a kind of like a retirement gift. So then Paul is born with Roman citizenship. I think the Lord set it up so that Paul would have these opportunities to get where he needs to go. So Paul is worried, but the Lord stands next to him and says this. And verse 11, the following night the Lord stood by him and said, cheer up, Paul, for as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify about me at Rome. I think this is super cool because immediately, imagine if it was you. I know if it was me, immediately I would realise I'm not going to die here in Jerusalem. Their plans against me are not going to succeed. I'm going to be delivered from all of this. I know I'm going to Rome. I know the Lord has plans for me beyond all the chaos that's happening right now. So I would have felt it was very encouraging for Paul. So there's this plot. They're trying to kill Paul, but Paul knows it's not going to work. And it doesn't. The Lord makes sure of it. The Lord gives him 470 soldiers to protect him. One guy. Yeah, no, the Lord wanted Paul to speak in Rome. When Paul wrote the letter to the Romans, he had written it before this all happened. Paul writes the letter to Rome in around about, different people work it out with different dates, but it's like 56, 57, 58 AD, somewhere in there. Paul is being caught here in around 58, I think. Somewhere here I wrote my dates down. But he might have written Romans in 56 and this happens in 58. It's something like that. And so Paul has already written the letter to the Romans and he said, it's my desire to come and visit you. I want to impart to you some gifts. And now the Lord appears to him and says, you're going to Rome. So he wants to go. The Lord's making a way for him to go. He knows at this point he's got a lot of work left to do. All right, well, you also have work to do. You may not know what it is. There may be things on your heart that you want to do for the Lord, but put it to the Lord. The Lord will have things he wants you to do, and maybe it's the same. Maybe what you want to do for him and what he wants you to do for him are the same, like with Paul, but maybe it's not the same. In which case, find out what the Lord wants you to do, and then be about the business of seeing that it happens. Father, I want to thank you for this chapter. Thank you for keeping Paul safe. We wouldn't have a big chunk of the Bible if you hadn't kept him safe. And I pray that your grace be upon us and fill us up and enable us to serve you as Paul did. Amen.